Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting on our detective hats to uncover a massive, multi-trillion-dollar shadow banking system. And guys, it's operating right under our noses, linking everything from local strip malls to illegal gold mines. We're going to break down this brilliant, honestly terrifying global network known simply as flying money. Let's get into it.
So, to kick things off, imagine this. You're holding $100,000 in dirty drug money right now, and you absolutely have to get this cash to your cartel bosses in another country. Well, you can't just walk into a regular bank and deposit it, right? That trips government alarms instantly. And you definitely can't pack it in a suitcase and take it on a flight because border security and scanners are actively hunting for it. So, what do? How do you move millions of dollars across borders without actually moving it?
The scale of this problem is just staggering. It's really hard to wrap your head around. Experts estimate that roughly 3 to 5% of the entire global GDP is actually the proceeds of crime. Put simply, that's about $4 trillion every single year. Whether we're talking drugs, weapons, or illegal wildlife trafficking, it all takes massive amounts of capital to function. And all that capital, it's just vanishing from our streets without a single trace.
Okay, so let's dive right into this ingenious, ghost-like network known as flying money. What is it? Well, it's a mostly invisible system that secretly connects the global underworld, and it transfers immense value without moving any physical cash. Think of it as the financial engine for organized crime. It seamlessly connects an illegal gold mine in the Congo to a drug cartel in Chicago to a totally normal-looking clothing store in Rome. The craziest part? It is entirely trust-based, making it almost impossible for traditional authorities to trace.
Section 1. Inventing flying money. Now, to truly understand how modern cartels operate today, we actually have to go way back in time. We need to trace the origins of this invisible string all the way back to China's Tang dynasty. See, back then, traveling businessmen faced a huge logistical headache. When they sold their goods in the bustling capital, they got paid in these really heavy copper coins. Carrying bags of heavy metal across long, dangerous distances back home just made them huge targets for robbers. So, they innovated. They created a trust-based system. A merchant in the capital would take those heavy coins and hand over a light piece of paper. The businessman would travel safely, hand that paper to a trusted partner merchant back in his hometown, and boom, receive his copper coins locally. The two merchants would just settle their debt with each other later on. The money never physically moved. It literally just flew.
Fast forward through history, and this brilliant concept of mirror transactions evolved. As Chinese immigrants spread globally, they unfortunately faced a lot of persecution and exclusion in their new countries. In response to that, they built these incredibly resilient, tight-knit commercial hubs, Chinatowns, anchored by strong cultural ties, self-reliance, and immense trust. These networks allowed them to thrive and safely send money to family around the world. But here's the twist. This beautiful, mutually beneficial system of trust and reciprocity, it was eventually hijacked by modern criminals, and they turned it into the ultimate shadow bank.
Section 2. How the system works. Let's look at these mirror transactions.
So, how do criminals actually abuse this system today to move millions? Let's walk through this step by step, because it's fascinating. Say a wealthy, legitimate businessman in China, let's call him Mr. Chen, wants to buy a luxury condo in Miami for $2 million. But the Chinese government severely restricts how much money can actually leave the country. So Mr. Chen gives his $2 million to an underground broker in China. Meanwhile, over in Chicago, a Mexican drug cartel has $2 million in dirty street cash they desperately need to send back to Mexico. They hand this dirty cash to a connected broker in the U.S. Now, these two brokers, one in China, one in the U.S., are trusted partners. They securely message each other. The U.S. broker takes the cartel's dirty cash and hands it right over to Mr. Chen's cousin in America. The cousin then deposits it across a bunch of local businesses to avoid any suspicion and eventually buys that Miami condo. Mr. Chen gets his real estate, the cartel's money has successfully entered the system, and crucially, not a single dollar ever crossed a physical border. Mind-blowing, right?
But wait, the brokers still owe each other. The Chinese broker owes the cartel $2 million, and the U.S. broker owes the Chinese broker. So how do they settle up? Well, they use the legitimate global economy through something called trade fraud. Here is exactly how it works. The cartel in Mexico wants to buy $10 million worth of refrigerators from the Chinese broker's legitimate front company. But the Chinese broker only invoices them for $8 million. The refrigerators get shipped, they clear customs, and they're sold in normal retail stores. But secretly built into that completely legal-looking trade transaction is a $2 million transfer of value. Everybody is settled up, and the authorities are totally none the wiser, because the ledger exists entirely in the minds of the trusted partners.
Section 3. Going undercover to infiltrate these networks.
Because this system leaves practically zero digital footprint or paper trail for traditional banks to flag, law enforcement is basically flying blind. And this has forced investigators to resort to some incredibly dangerous, old-school tactics to map out the network. Andrea Crosta, an intelligence investigator who actually spent over a decade infiltrating these networks, sums it up perfectly right here. He says, "The ledger is only trust. AI by itself is not going to make the case. You know, in an era where we rely heavily on artificial intelligence and digital surveillance to catch criminals, those tools are completely useless against the system built purely on human relationships and whispered agreements in back rooms."
So to combat this, Crosta's team utilizes classic, high-risk human intelligence. We're talking deploying rare, highly trained Chinese-speaking operatives who spend literally months slowly befriending traffickers at local Starbucks in Mexico City. They pose as businessmen, earning trust over countless coffees and dinners, and eventually they get introduced to corrupt airport customs officers. It's through these super dangerous face-to-face meetings that they uncover incredible secrets, like, get this, the use of a special chemical dye that traffickers literally spray onto cash to make it completely invisible to airport X-ray scanners. I mean, it is truly a game of shadows out there.
Moving on to Section 4, Cocaine of the Sea.
Let's see how this all builds together, because what these undercover agents ultimately discovered was that this shadow banking network doesn't just move cash. It moves an astonishing, dizzying variety of illicit value. And the deeper the investigators went, the more they realized just how interconnected global crime really is. For example, the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico harvests highly endangered totoaba fish bladders. This product is so valuable in traditional Chinese medicine that it's actually dubbed the cocaine of the sea. The cartel ships these fish bladders to the Chinese mafia. But the mafia doesn't pay them back in cash. Nope. Instead, they settle the debt by shipping precursor chemicals used to manufacture fentanyl right back to the cartel. Or they might settle up by heavily doctoring invoices for cheap, knockoff electronics imported into the US. They might even organize human trafficking routes. Wildlife poaching, deadly narcotics, and cheap electronics are all just woven together in one seamless transaction cycle.
And that leads us to a massive paradigm shift for law enforcement. The old mantra, as you've probably heard, was always follow the money. But as this explainer reveals, the new reality is that criminals no longer just move stacks of bills. They transfer immense value across a massive global triangle. To catch them today, authorities really have to focus on following the value, tracking that seamless shift from endangered wildlife over to pharmaceutical chemicals and finally to legitimate retail goods.
Which brings us to Section 5, stopping the shadow banks.
This invisible economy touches absolutely everything. It links luxury apartments in Vancouver to struggling fishermen in Peru and massive casinos in Myanmar to everyday electronics stores in New York. The big question is, can it actually be stopped? Well, the evolution of technology is actually making this harder to stop, not easier. Criminals are taking an ancient, low-tech system of absolute human trust, whether that's the Chinese flying money network or the Middle Eastern Habala system, and they're supercharging it with new school tech. They're settling debts using decentralized cryptocurrency and coordinating global smuggling routes via fully encrypted messaging apps like WeChat. When you pair unbreakable human trust with unbreakable digital encryption, the shadow bank literally becomes an absolute fortress from the outside.
So we are left with a massive challenge. The experts investigating this note that right now law enforcement agencies are heavily incentivized to chase quick, easy statistics, things like simple border drug busts. But dismantling a sprawling, multi-year, multinational shadow banking network, that requires immense patience, specialized human resources, and serious funding. So the question we have to leave you with today is this. How do we change the fundamental incentives for our law enforcement agencies to patiently unravel these massive webs of value before this invisible $4 trillion economy completely overwhelms our legitimate one? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep your eyes open, and I guarantee you'll never look at a mundane trade shipment the same way again.